Finally, let's talk about handling conflict better. As we've discussed, conflict is inevitable, and it's not inherently negative. One key part of handling conflict better is to notice the patterns of conflict that are happening within a specific relationship. So let's talk about identifying some of those conflict patterns. 4 common triggers for conflict include criticism, demand, cumulative annoyance, and rejection. Criticism happens when one individual comments on the other, and these comments evaluate another person's personality, behavior, appearance, or life choices. And it's important for us to recognize that criticism does not have to be meant as criticism for it to be perceived as such. You might think that you're just making a simple comment, but if the other person perceives it in a specific way, they might see it as being a criticism. A good way for us to avoid this one is to simply think before we speak. There are often alternative ways to phrase things that might be taken less personally by the other person. Another common trigger for conflict are demands, especially when these demands are viewed as unfair or irrelevant. And even demands that are rephrased as questions can still be perceived as demands. Things like tone of voice and context are really important factors here. Cumulative annoyance is a building frustration or anger that occurs over time, which eventually triggers this kind of conflict. So it's like the pressure within a pressure cooker is building up. And as that pressure builds, the intensity of the conflict builds along with it. You've probably been in a scenario where you were surprised that someone blew up at you, and it was likely because of cumulative annoyance. Maybe you didn't even know that there was a problem building. In order to avoid this, it's important for us to monitor our own level of annoyance and to occasionally let some steam out. We can process through our frustration with a third party, for example, or we can directly address what's bothering us with the source of that annoyance. And rejection can lead to conflict when one person's comments or behaviors are perceived as ignoring or invalidating the other person. So when someone feels like they are exposed or rejected, they often respond with anger in order to mask their hurt, which can ignite conflict. So we have to be careful of the way that we reject someone and make sure that we are not triggering that anger. Now, interpersonal conflict may also take the form of serial arguing. This is a repeated pattern of disagreement over an issue. And again, it doesn't necessarily indicate negative or troubled relationships, right? There are perfectly healthy relationships that engage in serial arguing. Some patterns to look out for here include repeating, mutual hostility, and arguing with assurances. If we are engaged in serial arguing that is repeating, this means that we are reminding the other person of our complaint over and over again. So we're telling them what we want them to start or stop doing, and we're kind of nagging them about it. And this may continue if the other person repeats their response to your reminder, right? If they keep doing it or not doing it, depending on what the complaint is. We might also engage in a pattern of mutual hostility. This occurs when the frustration of repeated conflict leads to really negative emotions, which can increase the likelihood of verbal aggression. However, verbal assurances of commitment can stem off some of the problems that are associated with repeating and mutual hostility patterns of serial arguing. These verbal assurances of commitment show a willingness on working to solve the conflict in the future. 2 common pitfalls that people fall into in conflict include one-upping and mind reading. One-upping is a quick reaction to communication from another person that escalates the conflict. So, for example, we heard earlier that one partner complained to the other that they had a long day and that they were tired, and their partner's response was, "You're tired." That's an example of one-upping, trying to make it seem like your problems are bigger and more important than the other person's problems are. When we engage in mind reading, on the other hand, this is communication where one person attributes something to the other using generalizations. In other words, we are presuming to know someone else's thoughts and feelings. And as a result, it's important for us to remember concepts like attribution and punctuation when when our partner is engaged in something like one-upping or mind reading. So often when we are in conflict, we are attributing behaviors to the wrong thing, right? We are making assumptions about the other person. Or we might assume that because we have been thinking about this as an issue for the past several weeks, that our partner has been doing so as well, and so often that is not the case. Oftentimes we are punctuating the conflict differently, and so while you have been thinking about it for weeks, your partner didn't know that it was a problem until 2 minutes ago when you started yelling at them, right? So these concepts of attribution and punctuation can become really important in handling conflict better. And finally, one of the most effective tools that we have to de-escalate a conflict is validation. Validation, or validating the person with whom we are in conflict, can really de-escalate the conflict super quickly. These validations can be as simple as demonstrating good listening skills, such as making eye contact, making verbal and nonverbal feedback to the other person. Now, validating the other person doesn't mean that you have to give up your side of the conflict, or even that you agree with what the other person is saying. Validating them simply means that you are hearing the other person out. You are hearing their complaint and providing your side of the story, perhaps. And the cool thing about handling conflict better is that it only takes one person with conflict management skills to make an interaction more effective. One person's competent response to a conflict can help to de-escalate the conflict significantly. So it's important for us to understand these patterns and be able to identify these patterns when we are in a conflict and hopefully respond competently.